What if everything you were taught about the Bible was incomplete? Not wrong necessarily, but deliberately incomplete. Deep in the highlands of Ethiopia, protected by ancient stone churches carved into mountainsides, lies a version of the Bible that Western Christianity has ignored for centuries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserves what they claim is the most complete canon of Scripture in existence, 81 books compared to the Protestant Bible's 66, or even the Catholic Bible's 73. According to historical records preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, their biblical canon was established in the 4th century CE and has remained unchanged since. While European councils were debating which books to include or exclude, Ethiopian Christians were safeguarding texts that scholars are only now beginning to rediscover. The difference isn't trivial. These aren't minor variations or alternative translations. The Ethiopian Bible contains entire books, complete narratives, prophecies, and teachings that were systematically removed from Western Christianity's sacred texts. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, Esdras, the Ascension of Isaiah. Books that were quoted by early church fathers, referenced in the New Testament itself, and then mysteriously disappeared from the canon that most Christians know today. Dr. James Charlesworth, a specialist in early Christian literature at Princeton Theological Seminary, has documented that several New Testament books contain direct references to texts that aren't in the Western Bible. The Book of Jude, for example, explicitly quotes the Book of Enoch, yet Enoch was excluded from the Protestant and Catholic canons. For centuries, Western scholars dismissed the Ethiopian Bible as exotic folklore, a curiosity from a distant church with questionable legitimacy. But archaeological discoveries over the past century have forced a dramatic reassessment. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 at Qumran, researchers found fragments of the Book of Enoch written in Aramaic, proving that this Ethiopian oddity was actually a Jewish text predating Christianity itself. The Ethiopian Church hadn't added extra books. They had simply preserved what others had lost. New carbon dating techniques applied to Ethiopian manuscripts have revealed that some of these texts are older than previously believed. Research published by the University of Oxford's Bodleian Library has confirmed that Ethiopian biblical manuscripts date back to at least the 4th and 5th centuries CE, contemporary with the oldest Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. The question becomes unavoidable. If the Ethiopian Bible contains books that were removed elsewhere, what was in those books that made them so dangerous? What truths were considered too radical, too challenging, too disruptive to allow the common believer to read? The answers, as you're about to discover, don't just fill in missing gaps. They fundamentally alter the entire narrative you thought you knew about creation, angels, prophecy, and the nature of Jesus himself. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history that academic institutions are finally acknowledging after centuries of dismissal. The manuscripts exist. The carbon dating is verified. The historical record is clear. What remains is a single question. Are you ready to see what was hidden? Let's start with numbers that most people have never questioned. The Protestant Bible contains 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. The Catholic Bible adds 7 books to the Old Testament, bringing the total to 73. But the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible contains 81 books in its canon. That's not a minor variation. That's 15 entire books that Protestant Christianity removed, and 8 books that even Catholic Christianity doesn't include. According to Dr. Ephraim Isaac, a leading scholar on Ethiopian biblical studies and founding director of the Institute of Semitic Studies at Princeton, the Ethiopian canon represents one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world. Their biblical texts were preserved in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language that became a sacred liturgical language, similar to how Latin functioned in Western Christianity. The books unique to the Ethiopian Bible include, for Enoch, a detailed apocalyptic text describing the fall of angels, the nature of heaven, and prophecies about the coming Messiah. This book is directly quoted in the New Testament book of Jude, yet it's absent from Western Bibles. Jubilees, often called Little Genesis, this book retells the events of Genesis and Exodus with additional details about creation, angels, and the calendar system used in ancient Israel. Esdras contains accounts of Jewish history from the time of Josiah to the return from Babylonian exile, with details not found in the canonical books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The Ascension of Isaiah describes Isaiah's mystical vision of heaven and contains one of the earliest references to the virgin birth of Jesus. For Baruch, also known as the Paralipomena of Jeremiah, this text deals with the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem and contains prophecies about restoration. What's particularly striking is that many of these books weren't obscure texts known only in Ethiopia. Research by Dr. Michael Stone at Hebrew University has demonstrated that books like Jubilees and 1 Enoch were widely circulated among early Jewish and Christian communities throughout the Mediterranean world. Fragments of these texts have been found at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Early church fathers like Tertullian, Origen, and Clement of Alexandria referenced these books in their writings. The evidence suggests these texts were considered authoritative scripture by many early Christians. So what happened? Why did Western Christianity exclude them, while Ethiopian Christianity preserved them? The answer lies in a series of church councils between the 4th and 16th centuries, where religious and political leaders debated which books were divinely inspired and which were merely useful for reading. The Council of Laodicea in 363 CE, the Council of Hippo in 393 CE, the Council of Carthage in 397 CE, and ultimately the Council of Trent in 1546 CE progressively narrowed the biblical canon. According to historical records from these councils, the criteria for inclusion were complex: apostolic authorship, widespread use in churches, consistency with accepted doctrine, and, perhaps most tellingly, alignment with the theological positions the councils were trying to establish. Dr. Bart Ehrman, a New Testament scholar at the University of North Carolina, has documented how political and theological disputes heavily influenced which books were canonized. Texts that challenged emerging orthodoxy or contained teachings that contradicted official church positions faced exclusion. The Ethiopian Church, geographically isolated from these European councils and maintaining its own ancient traditions, simply continued using the books they had always considered sacred. They weren't adding anything new. They were refusing to remove what they believed God had given them. We're living in times when the boundaries between history and mystery are dissolving. New discoveries are emerging from ancient archives, challenging everything we thought we knew about early Christianity. But here's what matters. You're not alone in this search for truth. Thousands of viewers from around the world are discovering these hidden chapters of history, and you're now part of that community. If these revelations resonate with you, I invite you to join our exclusive membership community. This isn't just about watching videos. It's about being part of a global network of truth seekers who refuse to accept incomplete narratives. Become a member now and access extended research content we can't make public, direct discussions with fellow investigators, early access to groundbreaking discoveries, behind-the-scenes analysis and sources. Click the Join button below this video. Your perspective matters, your questions matter, your journey to understanding matters. And maybe, just maybe, what you discover here will change how you see everything. Of all the books preserved in the Ethiopian Bible but excluded from Western canons, none is more controversial than the Book of Enoch. This ancient text claims to be written by Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, who according to Genesis walked with God and he was not, for God took him. The book describes Enoch's journey through the heavens, his conversations with angels, and his visions of events that would unfold in human history. But here's what makes this particularly significant. The Book of Enoch isn't just referenced in obscure traditions. It's directly quoted in the New Testament. Jude 1:14-15 states, "Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone." This is a direct quote from 1 Enoch 1:9. If a New Testament book quotes Enoch as a prophet and authoritative source, why was his book removed from the Bible that most Christians use today? Dr. Margaret Barker, a biblical scholar and former president of the Society for Old Testament Study, has researched extensively how the Book of Enoch was treated by early Christianity. According to her findings, Enoch was widely accepted as scripture by many early church fathers. Tertullian argued that since Jude quoted Enoch, the book should be considered inspired. Clement of Alexandria cited Enoch repeatedly in his writings. So why the exclusion? The content is problematic for certain theological positions. First, Enoch describes in vivid detail how the Watchers, a group of angels, descended to earth, took human wives, and produced offspring called the Nephilim. These fallen angels taught humans forbidden knowledge, weapons, cosmetics, sorcery, astrology, and other secrets of heaven. According to the Book of Enoch, this angelic rebellion corrupted humanity so thoroughly that God had to send the great flood to cleanse the earth. The text presents a cosmic battle between good and evil that extends far beyond the simple Genesis account. The book also contains detailed descriptions of different levels of heaven, the nature of angels and demons, calendrical systems, and prophecies about the coming Messiah that don't align perfectly with later Christian interpretations. Research by Dr. James Van der Kam at the University of Notre Dame has shown that when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, multiple copies of one Enoch were found among them, written in Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke. Carbon dating places these fragments between 200 BCE and 50 CE. The Qumran community, likely Essenes, clearly valued this text highly. Early Judaism and Christianity had no problem with Enoch. The trouble began when later church councils started standardizing doctrine. The Book of Enoch's detailed angelology, with named angels having specific roles and hierarchies, complicated emerging Christian theology about the nature of spiritual beings. Its emphasis on a solar calendar, rather than lunar, challenged rabbinic traditions. Its apocalyptic visions and detailed descriptions of divine judgment made church authorities uncomfortable. By the 4th century CE, as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, church leaders wanted a unified, controllable doctrine. Texts like Enoch, with their complex cosmologies and emphasis on direct mystical experience, were seen as potentially divisive. According to historical records from the Council of Laodicea, church leaders specifically listed which books should be read in churches. Enoch wasn't on the list. St. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate, around 400 CE, explicitly excluded Enoch, arguing that it wasn't accepted by Jewish authorities of his time. St. Augustine also questioned its canonical status. Within a few centuries, the Book of Enoch had effectively disappeared from Western Christianity. Copies were lost or destroyed. The text survived only in Ethiopia, where it remained part of the biblical canon. For over 1,000 years, Western scholars knew about the Book of Enoch only through fragmentary quotes in early Christian writings. Many assumed it was lost forever. Then in 1773, Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 copies of the complete Book of Enoch back to Europe from Ethiopia. For the first time in over a millennium, Western scholars could read the entire text that Jude had quoted, and early Christians had considered Scripture. The discovery was revolutionary, but also deeply uncomfortable for established churches. Here was an ancient biblical book, quoted in the New Testament itself, that had been systematically excluded from the canon. Modern research has only deepened the mystery. Analysis by Dr. Gabriele Boccaccini at the University of Michigan suggests that Enochic literature may represent an entire stream of early Jewish thought that was eventually suppressed as Rabbinic Judaism and Orthodox Christianity solidified their positions. The question isn't whether the Book of Enoch is ancient, authentic, and influential. The evidence proves that conclusively. The question is why church councils decided you shouldn't read it. Have you ever heard about the Book of Enoch before this moment? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm fascinated to learn what our community already knows about this. Your insights might illuminate something others haven't considered yet. While the Book of Enoch might be the most famous excluded text, the Book of Jubilees presents an equally profound challenge to Western biblical understanding. Jubilees is essentially a retelling of Genesis and the first part of Exodus, but with extensive additional material that fundamentally changes how we understand the creation narrative, the lives of the patriarchs, and the origin of divine laws. According to the text itself, Jubilees was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai by the Angel of the Presence, one of the highest-ranking angels in heaven. This angel dictated the entire history of the world from creation to the giving of the law, organized according to Jubilee periods of 49 years. Dr. James Van der Kam, whose research on Jubilees has been published extensively, notes that this book was extremely popular in ancient Judaism. When fragments were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, researchers found at least 15 different manuscript copies of Jubilees at Qumran, more than most books of the Hebrew Bible. Clearly this wasn't some marginal text. It was central to how some Jewish communities understood their sacred history. So what does Jubilees say that Genesis doesn't? For one, it provides precise chronological details. Genesis gives ages and lifespans, but doesn't organize them into a comprehensive timeline. Jubilees organizes all of history into exact Jubilee periods, creating what its adherents believed was a divine calendar, revealing God's plan for human history. More significantly, Jubilees contains extensive material about angels and their role in creation and human affairs. According to Jubilees, God created angels on the first day of creation before he created light. The text describes different classes of angels with specific responsibilities: angels of the presence, angels of sanctification, angels of natural phenomena like fire, wind, and clouds. The book also expands dramatically on the Genesis account of Noah's flood. According to Jubilees, after the flood, demons, the spirits of the deceased Nephilim, began tormenting Noah's descendants. Noah prayed to God, who ordered that 9/10 of the demons be bound, but allowed 1/10 to remain free under the command of Mastema, a satanic figure, to test and accuse humanity. This is radically different from the Genesis account, which mentions the Nephilim briefly, but provides no details about demons or spiritual warfare after the flood. Jubilees also contains extensive legal material, detailed explanations of when Sabbaths should be observed, which festivals should be celebrated, and how dietary laws and purity regulations. According to the text, these laws existed from creation itself, not just from the time of Moses. Research by Dr. Betsy Halpern Amaru at Vassar College has demonstrated that Jubilees reflects a particular strand of early Judaism that was extremely concerned with maintaining ritual purity and following a specific solar calendar rather than a lunar calendar. This calendar dispute was actually one of the major theological controversies in ancient Judaism. The book's calendar system is based on 364 days, 52 weeks exactly, which means the same festival days always fall on the same day of the week every year. According to Jubilees, this is the calendar God intended from creation, the calendar written in the heavenly tablets. But here's the problem. This calendar system is completely different from the lunar calendar that Rabbinic Judaism adopted and that early Christianity inherited. If Jubilees is correct about the divinely ordained calendar, then most of Jewish and Christian history has been observing festivals on the wrong dates. That's not a minor theological quibble. That's a fundamental challenge to religious authority. According to historical analysis by Dr. John Endres at Jesuit School of Theology, Jubilees also presents a different view of how God's law functions. Rather than the law being given specifically to Israel at Sinai, Jubilees argues that the law existed from creation and was followed by righteous figures like Enoch, Noah, and Abraham long before Moses. This creates a universal dimension to Torah observance that complicated later Christian arguments about the law being specifically Jewish or specifically given at a particular historical moment. As Christianity developed its theology of supersessionism, the idea that the new covenant replaced the old, texts like Jubilees became theologically inconvenient. If the law existed from creation itself and was written in heaven, it becomes much harder to argue that it was temporary or has been abolished. By the 4th and 5th centuries, as church councils were establishing the biblical canon, Jubilees had effectively disappeared from mainstream Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. Only in Ethiopia did it survive as scripture. The evidence keeps mounting. If you want to dive deeper into historical discoveries like this, consider joining our membership community. Click Join below. Let's uncover truth together. One of the most intriguing mysteries in Christian history involves a simple question. What was Jesus doing between ages 12 and 30? The canonical Gospels are almost completely silent on this period. Luke mentions Jesus at age 12 in the temple, astounding teachers with his understanding. Then, nothing. The narrative jumps directly to Jesus at approximately age 30, being baptized by John in the Jordan River. 18 years of silence. Various traditions have attempted to fill this gap. Some suggest Jesus was simply working as a carpenter in Nazareth. Others propose he traveled, to India, Egypt, or even Britain. Most of these theories lack substantial historical evidence. But Ethiopian Christian tradition offers a different narrative, preserved in texts and oral traditions that have been maintained for centuries. According to Ethiopian Orthodox sources documented by scholars like Dr. Ephraim Isaac, Ethiopian tradition holds that there was contact between the Holy Family and Ethiopia even during Jesus' infancy. The tradition identifies one of the Magi who visited the infant Jesus as King Bazan of Aksum, making Ethiopia one of the first nations to acknowledge Christ. More significantly, Ethiopian tradition preserved in the Kibra Nagast, Glory of Kings, and related texts suggests ongoing connections between early Christianity and Ethiopian Judaism, particularly through the Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in Acts 8:26-40. This account, which appears in the canonical New Testament, describes how Philip the Evangelist encountered an Ethiopian court official, a eunuch serving the Kandake, queen of Ethiopia, who was reading from the book of Isaiah. Philip explained the scriptures to him, baptized him, and according to Ethiopian tradition, this official returned to Ethiopia and helped establish Christianity there. But here's what Western Christianity rarely considers. This Ethiopian official was already reading Hebrew scriptures. He was already studying the prophets. This suggests an established Jewish or Judaizing community in Ethiopia that predated Christianity itself. Ethiopian tradition holds that this community descended from the time of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, creating a connection between Ethiopia and Judaism that goes back nearly 1,000 years before Jesus. Research by Dr. Stephen Kaplan at Hebrew University has documented the existence of the Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews, whose traditions claim descent from ancient Israelite origins. While the exact historical details are debated, the presence of an ancient Jewish community in Ethiopia is well established. What does this have to do with Jesus' lost years? According to some Ethiopian traditions, preserved in apocryphal texts like the Conflict of Adam and Eve, which exists in fuller form in Ethiopian manuscripts, there were connections between the Holy Family and North African communities during the flight to Egypt. The Gospel of Matthew confirms that Joseph took Mary and the infant Jesus to Egypt to escape Herod's massacre. Egyptian Christian tradition, particularly among Copts, identifies specific locations in Egypt where the Holy Family stayed. But Ethiopia is right next door to Egypt. Ethiopian traditions suggest that during the period in Egypt, or potentially during Jesus' later years, there may have been contact with Ethiopian Jewish and proto-Christian communities. Now, does this mean Jesus definitely traveled to Ethiopia? The historical evidence is not conclusive enough to make that claim definitively. What we can say, based on documented research, is that Ethiopian Christianity preserves some of the oldest continuous Christian traditions outside the Mediterranean world. Ethiopian biblical texts contain material about Jesus' teachings and early Christian practices that don't appear in Western canons. The Ethiopian Church's claims of apostolic-era origins are taken seriously by historians studying early Christianity's spread. Dr. Elizabeth Castelli at Barnard College has researched how Christianity spread through Africa much earlier than traditional European-centered histories acknowledge. Archaeological evidence from Aksum shows Christian influence by the 4th century CE, but Ethiopian traditions claim apostolic origins from the 1st century through the Ethiopian eunuch. The broader point is this: when we look at early Christianity only through the lens of Roman and later European Christianity, we miss entire branches of the faith that developed in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Ethiopian Christianity wasn't a later development that diverged from authentic Christianity. According to their own well-documented traditions and increasingly supported by archaeological research, they represent one of the original forms of Christianity, developing in parallel with, not derivative from, Mediterranean Christianity. Their preserved texts about Jesus, Mary, the Apostles, and early Christian practice offer perspectives that were excluded when European councils decided which books were canonical and which traditions were authoritative. Whether Jesus himself traveled to Ethiopia may remain uncertain, but what's becoming clear is that the connection between early Christianity and Ethiopia runs much deeper than Western Christianity has acknowledged. If these discoveries are challenging your understanding in profound ways, you belong with us. Join our exclusive membership community, where serious researchers gather to explore what history tried to erase. Become a member now. Perhaps no story better illustrates the difference between Western biblical understanding and Ethiopian tradition than the account of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. In the Western Bible, the story is brief. 1 Kings 10 and 2 Chronicles 9 describe how the Queen of Sheba heard of Solomon's wisdom, traveled to Jerusalem with gifts, tested him with difficult questions, was amazed by his wisdom and wealth, and then returned to her own land. The account takes up barely 2 chapters and provides almost no personal details about the queen herself. But in Ethiopian tradition, preserved primarily in the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, this story is exponentially more detailed and more consequential. According to the Kebra Nagast, which was compiled in the 14th century, but draws on much older traditions, the Queen of Sheba was named Makeda and ruled over Ethiopia and parts of Arabia. The text describes her journey to Jerusalem not as a brief diplomatic visit, but as an extended stay during which she and Solomon developed a deep relationship. The Kebra Nagast claims that Solomon and Makeda had a son named Menelik, meaning son of the wise man. According to Ethiopian tradition, when Menelik came of age, he traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father Solomon. Solomon wanted Menelik to remain and succeed him, but Menelik chose to return to Ethiopia to rule his mother's kingdom. The text then describes something extraordinary. Menelik, with the help of Levite priests who accompanied him back to Ethiopia, brought the Ark of the Covenant from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. Yes, according to Ethiopian tradition, the real Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest containing the 10 Commandments, hasn't been lost. It's been in Ethiopia for nearly 3,000 years, currently housed in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum. Now, is this historically verifiable? The Ark itself is never shown to outsiders or researchers, so direct evidence is impossible to obtain. But the tradition is remarkably consistent and deeply embedded in Ethiopian culture and religious practice. Dr. Stuart Munro-Hay, a specialist in Aksumite history, has documented how central the Solomonic dynasty claim is to Ethiopian royal tradition. From the time of the Kebra Nagast's compilation until the overthrow of Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974, Ethiopian emperors claimed direct descent from Solomon and Makeda through Menelik. This wasn't viewed as legend or mythology. It was considered historical fact and the divine legitimization of the royal dynasty. But here's what makes this particularly relevant to our investigation. If Ethiopian tradition about the Solomonic bloodline is taken seriously, it means that the descendants of King David, the bloodline from which biblical prophecy says the Messiah would come, extended to Africa. And if that Davidic bloodline existed in Ethiopia, it creates a completely different framework for understanding early Christianity's relationship with Africa. The Gospel of Matthew begins with a genealogy of Jesus, tracing his descent through David back to Abraham. This genealogy is considered crucial because it establishes Jesus' credentials as the prophesied Messiah from David's line. But Matthew's genealogy only traces Jesus through Joseph, and Christian theology holds that Joseph wasn't Jesus' biological father. The genealogy serves a legal adoptive purpose, but doesn't represent genetic descent. Ethiopian tradition, however, claims a different connection to the Davidic line, through Solomon and Makeda, spreading to Africa centuries before Jesus. Whether one accepts the specific claim about Menelik and the Ark, the broader historical point is documented. There were connections between ancient Israel and Ethiopia that Western biblical tradition largely ignores. The presence of the Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews, demonstrates ancient Semitic religious practice in Ethiopia. Archaeological evidence from Axum shows advanced civilization and international trade connections during the biblical period. The Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 demonstrates existing knowledge of Hebrew scripture in Ethiopia during apostolic times. Research by Dr. Edward Ullendorf, a scholar of Ethiopian studies at the University of London, has examined how deeply Hebraic elements are embedded in Ethiopian Christianity, far more than in any other branch of Christianity. Their liturgy, calendar, and religious practices maintain elements that appear to derive from ancient Jewish tradition. The story of Solomon and Sheba, whether historically accurate in all its details or not, represents a truth that Western Christianity has often overlooked. The biblical narrative extends far beyond the Mediterranean world. Africa was never peripheral to biblical history. It was central. The evidence keeps mounting. If you want to dive deeper into historical discoveries like this, consider joining our membership community. Click Join below. Let's uncover truth together. At this point, a skeptical viewer might reasonably ask, how do we know any of this is authentic? Couldn't Ethiopian traditions simply be later additions or legendary embellishments? This is where modern archaeological science provides fascinating answers. When researchers first gained access to Ethiopian biblical manuscripts, many assumed they were relatively recent copies, perhaps from the medieval period at earliest. The prevailing view in Western scholarship was that Ethiopian Christianity was a later derivative tradition. Carbon-14 dating and other scientific analysis methods have fundamentally challenged that assumption. In 2016, researchers from the University of Oxford's Bodleian Library conducted radiocarbon analysis on an Ethiopian manuscript of the Garima Gospels, one of the oldest illuminated Christian manuscripts in existence. The results, published in academic journals, were startling. The analysis dated the Garima Gospels to between 330 and 650 CE, with the most probable date being around 390-570 CE. This makes them contemporary with, and possibly older than, many of the oldest Greek New Testament manuscripts that Western Christianity has relied upon. Dr. Judith Mackenzie, an archaeologist at Oxford who participated in the analysis, noted that this finding demonstrates Ethiopian Christianity's ancient roots and challenges assumptions about the timeline of Christianity's spread into Africa. But the Garima Gospels are just one example. Analysis of other Ethiopian manuscripts has consistently pushed back their dates much earlier than previously assumed. The discovery and dating of biblical texts among the Dead Sea Scrolls has been particularly significant for validating the Ethiopian biblical tradition. When the Qumran caves were excavated between 1947 and 1956, researchers found fragments of texts that had only survived in complete form in Ethiopia. Multiple copies of 1 Enoch written in Aramaic were found at Qumran, dating from the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE. This proved definitively that Enoch was not an Ethiopian invention, but an ancient Jewish text that the Ethiopian Church had preserved. Similarly, fragments of Jubilees were found at Qumran, again in Hebrew and Aramaic, dating to approximately the same period. The Dead Sea Scrolls community clearly valued these texts that later Judaism and Christianity excluded. According to research by Dr. Michael Stone at Hebrew University, the Qumran library included texts that suggest a much more diverse early Judaism than later rabbinic tradition acknowledged. The community at Qumran, possibly Essenes, used a solar calendar similar to what Jubilees describes, celebrated festivals differently from the Jerusalem Temple, and preserved texts that challenged mainstream Second Temple Judaism. When these texts were being written and copied at Qumran, they weren't apocrypha or pseudepigrapha. They were considered authoritative scripture by at least some Jewish communities. The Ethiopian Church's preservation of these same texts, therefore, isn't an aberration. It's a continuation of a legitimate ancient tradition that existed in Judaism before the biblical canon was narrowed. Modern scientific analysis has also examined the consistency of Ethiopian biblical texts. Because Ethiopia was geographically isolated from Mediterranean Christianity, there was less opportunity for manuscripts to be corrected or harmonized with evolving orthodoxy. Research comparing Ethiopian manuscripts of biblical books with Greek and Latin versions has revealed interesting patterns. In many cases, Ethiopian versions preserve readings that appear older and less edited than Mediterranean versions, suggesting they branched off from earlier textual traditions. Dr. Brent Nongbre, a textual scholar at the Australian Catholic University, has written extensively about how manuscript dating and textual analysis challenge simplistic narratives about biblical development. His research demonstrates that the history of biblical texts is far more complex, diverse, and contested than most believers realize. The Ethiopian biblical tradition stands as physical evidence of this complexity. These aren't later additions or corruptions of an original pure text. They represent one of several ancient streams of biblical tradition, preserved with remarkable consistency in Africa, while Mediterranean Christianity was still debating and editing its canon. Where in the world are you watching from? It amazes me that these historical revelations are reaching truth seekers across continents. Drop your country or city below. Let's build a global community of investigators. To understand why the Ethiopian Bible differs so dramatically from Western canons, we need to examine the historical moment when the biblical canon began to be standardized and who held the power to make those decisions. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE is often portrayed in popular culture as the moment when Christianity decided which books would be in the Bible and which would be excluded. That's somewhat simplified, but the council did represent a critical turning point. Emperor Constantine, who had recently ended persecution of Christians and made Christianity a favored religion of the Roman Empire, called the council to resolve disputes that were threatening Christian unity, particularly the Arian controversy about the nature of Christ. According to historical records preserved by early church historians like Eusebius and Socrates Scholasticus, approximately 300 bishops gathered at Nicaea. The vast majority came from the eastern part of the empire. Representation from the Western Empire was limited, and representation from African Christianity beyond Egypt was essentially non-existent. Ethiopian Christianity, though already established according to their traditions, was not represented at Nicaea. Neither were the Christian communities that had developed in Persia, India, or other regions outside Roman control. This is crucial to understand. The councils that decided which books belonged in the Bible were not universal gatherings of all Christians. They were meetings of bishops within the Roman Empire's sphere of influence, making decisions that reflected the theological and political concerns of that specific time and place. Dr. Henry Chadwick, a church historian at Oxford University, has documented how political considerations heavily influenced theological debates at Nicaea and subsequent councils. Constantine wanted unity because disunited Christians were harder to govern and less useful as a unifying force for the empire. Texts that were controversial, that emphasized diversity of thought, or that contained teachings that complicated imperial Christianity's message, faced increasing pressure. The actual canonization of Scripture happened gradually through several councils. The Council of Hippo in 393 CE and the Council of Carthage in 397 CE produced lists of canonical books that closely resemble the modern Catholic Bible. The Protestant Reformation later reduced the canon further, removing the deuterocanonical books that Catholics retained. But here's the critical point. None of these councils included representatives from Ethiopian Christianity, which had by then been established for centuries. According to Dr. Tadesse Tamrat, a historian of Ethiopian Christianity at Addis Ababa University, the Ethiopian Church traces its formal establishment to the 4th century through Saint Frumentius, who was consecrated as the first bishop of Axum by Athanasius of Alexandria around 330 CE. Athanasius, coincidentally, was one of the key figures at the Council of Nicaea, defending the Trinitarian position against Arianism. His connection with Ethiopian Christianity demonstrates that Ethiopia wasn't isolated from Mediterranean Christianity, but it also wasn't controlled by it. When Mediterranean councils decided which books to exclude from the canon, Ethiopian Christianity wasn't represented at those discussions and didn't feel bound by those decisions. They simply continued using the books they had always considered sacred. Research by Dr. L.W. Barnard has shown that the process of canon formation was driven by multiple factors: apostolic authorship or connection, real or claimed, widespread use in established churches, theological consistency with emerging orthodoxy, elimination of texts that supported heretical positions. That last point is particularly important. Heretical is determined by whoever has the power to make such declarations. In the 4th–6th centuries, that power resided with bishops meeting in councils under imperial patronage. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas, which emphasized individual spiritual knowledge over institutional authority, were labeled Gnostic and excluded. The Gospel of Peter, which contained a vivid resurrection scene, was deemed too fantastic and excluded. The Shepherd of Hermas, widely popular in early Christianity, was eventually deemed non-canonical, despite its continued use. The Ethiopian Church, operating outside this power structure, preserved texts based on their own criteria and traditions. They weren't rebels against a universal consensus. They were a parallel tradition that maintained its own ancient canon. This is why modern biblical scholarship increasingly recognizes that there isn't a single original Bible that was later corrupted or added to. Rather, there were multiple textual traditions from the beginning, reflecting Christianity's diversity across different geographical and cultural contexts. The evidence keeps mounting. If you want to dive deeper into historical discoveries like this, consider joining our membership community. Click Join below. Let's uncover truth together. One of the most striking differences between the Ethiopian biblical canon and Western versions involves the treatment of angels, demons, and the cosmic spiritual warfare that early Christians believed surrounded them. The books preserved in the Ethiopian Bible, particularly 1 Enoch, Jubilees, and other texts, contain extensive, detailed teachings about the nature of spiritual beings that are almost entirely absent from Western Christianity's biblical canon. Let's start with what these texts say about the origin of evil. According to 1 Enoch, evil entered the world not primarily through human disobedience, Adam and Eve, but through angelic rebellion. The book describes how 200 angels called Watchers descended to earth, took human women as wives, and produced hybrid offspring called Nephilim, giants who corrupted and dominated humanity. These Watchers also taught humans forbidden knowledge. According to the text, the angel Azazel taught humans how to make weapons and armor for war. Semjaza taught enchantments and root-cutting, sorcery. Armaros taught the countering of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught portents. Tamiel taught astrology. And Asradel taught the motion of the moon. The text presents this forbidden knowledge as corrupting because it was given prematurely. Humanity wasn't spiritually mature enough to handle such power responsibly. This framework dramatically changes how we understand the nature of evil and human free will. In standard Western Christian theology, evil enters through Adam and Eve's choice to disobey God. Humans bear primary responsibility for sin. In the Enochic tradition, humanity is portrayed more as victims of angelic corruption, seduced and manipulated by powerful spiritual beings who shouldn't have interfered in human development. Dr. Annette Yoshiko Reed at New York University has researched how different theories about evil's origin competed in early Judaism and Christianity. The Enochic tradition was extremely influential in the Second Temple period, but was gradually marginalized as Rabbinic Judaism and Orthodox Christianity developed different theological frameworks. The Book of Jubilees adds another layer to this cosmology. After the flood destroys the Nephilim, their spirits become demons who plague Noah's descendants. Noah prays to God to bind them, and God commands that 9/10 of demons be imprisoned. However, 1/10 remain free under the command of Mastema, a satanic figure, to test and accuse humanity. This explains, according to Jubilees, why demons continue to exist after the flood. They're the disembodied spirits of the destroyed Nephilim, allowed to remain as part of God's testing of human faithfulness. Western Christianity eventually developed its demonology primarily from New Testament references and later medieval theology. The elaborate hierarchies of demons, theories about possession and exorcism, and the role of Satan as God's adversary were constructed largely without the detailed frameworks provided in texts like Enoch and Jubilees. Ethiopian Christianity, by preserving these texts, maintained a much more developed angelology and demonology directly connected to ancient Jewish traditions. Research by Dr. Martha Himmelfarb at Princeton University has shown that early Christian communities were deeply concerned with spiritual warfare, exorcism, and protection from demonic forces. The absence of detailed teachings about demons in the canonical New Testament is somewhat puzzling, given how central these concerns were to early Christian practice. The preserved Ethiopian texts help explain this gap. Early Christians didn't need elaborate demonology in the New Testament because they had access to texts like Enoch and Jubilees that provided that framework. When those texts were excluded from the Western canon, later Christianity had to reconstruct its understanding of spiritual warfare without the foundational texts that explained the origin and nature of demons. This also affects how we understand Jesus' ministry. The Gospels are full of exorcisms. Jesus casting out demons is one of his most frequent activities. But the canonical Gospels don't explain where demons come from or why they plague humanity. With the Enochic texts, there's a coherent backstory. Demons are the spirits of the Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers' rebellion. Jesus' exorcisms represent the Messiah's power over the forces of corruption that have plagued humanity since before the flood. The Ethiopian biblical tradition thus preserves a more complete cosmological framework that connects creation, angelic rebellion, the flood, ongoing spiritual warfare, and the Messiah's ultimate victory over evil into a single, coherent narrative. Have you ever felt that traditional Christianity's explanation of evil and demons was incomplete, that there were missing pieces to the story? Share your experience below. Many in this community have felt the same way. Of all the claims made by Ethiopian tradition, none is more astounding than this. The Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in biblical history, isn't lost. It's in Ethiopia. According to Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, the Ark of the Covenant has been housed in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum, Ethiopia, for nearly 3,000 years. Before we dismiss this as legend, let's examine what we know and what we don't know about the Ark's historical fate. The biblical account is clear about the Ark's significance. Described in Exodus 25, the Ark was a gold-covered wooden chest containing the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod, and a jar of manna. It represented God's presence among the Israelites and was kept in the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple. But then, the biblical record falls silent. The last clear biblical reference to the Ark in its original context is during the reign of Josiah in 2 Chronicles 35:3, around 640-609 BCE. After that, nothing. The Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BCE and the destruction of Solomon's temple are described in detail in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, but neither book mentions what happened to the Ark. When the Second Temple was built after the Babylonian exile, historical sources indicate that the Holy of Holies was empty, no Ark. The Talmud confirms this, stating that 5 things were missing from the Second Temple, including the Ark. So where did it go? Various theories have been proposed. It was destroyed by the Babylonians. It was hidden by priests before Jerusalem fell. It was taken to Babylon as spoil. It's buried somewhere in Jerusalem. It was removed by the Knights Templar and taken to Europe. Ethiopian tradition offers a different answer. It was never there when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem because it had been taken to Ethiopia centuries earlier by Menelik, the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. According to the Kebra Nagast, when Menelik visited his father Solomon in Jerusalem and then returned to Ethiopia, a group of firstborn sons of Israelite priests accompanied him. These young men, led by Azariah son of Zadok the high priest, brought the Ark with them, either with Menelik's knowledge or secretly, depending on which version of the tradition you read. The text claims Solomon discovered the Ark was gone, pursued Menelik's party, but ultimately saw this as divine will and allowed the Ark to remain with his son in Ethiopia. Is there any evidence to support this extraordinary claim? The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum does indeed have a heavily guarded chapel that supposedly contains the Ark. However, no one except the designated guardian monk is allowed to see it. Even the Ethiopian patriarch and emperors were forbidden from viewing it directly. This makes verification impossible through normal means. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's position is that the Ark is too holy for public display or scientific examination. Dr. Stuart Munro Hay, who extensively researched Aksumite history, documented that the tradition of the Ark being in Axum is ancient and deeply embedded in Ethiopian religious practice. Every Ethiopian Orthodox Church has a replica Ark, tabut, that is central to their liturgy and is processed during major festivals. Some researchers have noted intriguing historical details. According to 2 Maccabees 2:4-8, a deuterocanonical book, the prophet Jeremiah hid the Ark before the Babylonian conquest, placing it in a cave on Mount Nebo. The text says it will remain hidden until God gathers his people together again. But what if Jeremiah's concealment and the Ark's removal to Ethiopia are both true? What if the Ark was taken to Ethiopia and Jeremiah's hiding refers to a replica or other temple vessels? The timing is plausible. If Menelik lived during Solomon's reign, circa 950 BCE, and the Ark left Jerusalem with him, it would have been gone for over 350 years before the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE, plenty of time for the absence to be concealed or forgotten by most of the population. Dr. Graham Hancock, though controversial in some of his theories, has documented significant evidence of Jewish practices in Ethiopia that predate Christianity and could suggest ancient Israelite contact. The Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews, have traditions of temple practices that seem remarkably detailed for a community allegedly isolated from Jerusalem for millennia. Archaeological research in Aksum has revealed that the city was an important international trading center during the biblical period, with connections to Arabia, Egypt, and possibly the Mediterranean world. The infrastructure and civilization revealed there could certainly have supported preserving a sacred object like the Ark. But let's be clear, without the ability to examine what's claimed to be in that chapel in Aksum, we cannot scientifically verify the Ethiopian claim. The Ark may be there. It may not. It may be a replica that Ethiopians believe is the original. What we can say definitively is this: the biblical Ark of the Covenant disappeared from the historical record. The Ethiopian explanation for where it went is ancient, consistent, and deeply believed. And no other explanation has produced the Ark either. The mystery remains unsolved. Western Christianity has typically portrayed the spread of Christianity as flowing from Jerusalem outward to the Roman Empire, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, and eventually throughout Europe. Africa, in this narrative, comes late to the story. Christianity supposedly reached North Africa through Roman expansion, but sub-Saharan Africa wasn't evangelized until much later, perhaps medieval times or even the colonial period. This narrative, as recent scholarship has increasingly demonstrated, is fundamentally wrong. Christianity reached Africa, specifically Ethiopia, in the apostolic period, the 1st century CE, and it developed there not as a derivative copy of Mediterranean Christianity, but as an independent parallel tradition with its own texts, practices, and theological frameworks. The Book of Acts provides the earliest documentary evidence. Acts 8, 26-40 describes Philip the evangelist encountering an Ethiopian court official who was reading from the prophet Isaiah. This wasn't some ignorant pagan encountering scripture for the first time. This was a high-ranking official already deeply engaged with Hebrew prophetic texts. The official asks Philip to explain a passage from Isaiah 53 about the suffering servant. Philip uses this as an opportunity to teach about Jesus and baptizes the Ethiopian, who then returns to his country. Ethiopian tradition holds that this official, traditionally identified as the royal treasurer named Simeon Bakos, brought Christianity back to the Ethiopian court and began the process of evangelization there. But here's what's often missed. This official wasn't just familiar with Isaiah. According to the text, he had traveled to Jerusalem to worship, suggesting he was either Jewish or a God-fearer associated with Judaism. He had a scroll of Isaiah, an expensive item in the 1st century, indicating wealth, education, and serious religious commitment. This suggests that there was already an established connection between Ethiopia and Judaism before Christianity arrived. Research by Dr. Kaplan at Hebrew University has documented that the Beta Israel Ethiopian Jews have oral traditions claiming descent from ancient Israelite origins, some tracing back to the time of Moses, others to the time of Solomon and Sheba, still others to the Babylonian exile period. While the exact historical origins are debated, the existence of an ancient Judaizing community in Ethiopia is well established. This community would have had Hebrew scriptures, knowledge of temple practices, and theological frameworks that made them receptive to the Christian message about the Jewish Messiah. The formal establishment of Ethiopian Christianity as a state religion is usually dated to the reign of King Ezana of Aksum in the 4th century CE. According to historical sources preserved by Rufinus and other early church historians, 2 Christian youths from Tyre, Frumentius and Aedesius, were shipwrecked on the Red Sea coast and eventually reached the Aksumite court. They were educated at the royal court, and eventually Frumentius was sent to Alexandria, where Athanasius, the defender of orthodoxy at the Council of Nicaea, consecrated him as the first bishop of Aksum around 330 CE. This establishes a clear apostolic connection between Ethiopian Christianity and the wider church. Frumentius, called Abba Selama, Father of Peace, in Ethiopian tradition, evangelized the nobility and helped establish Christianity as the official religion. But this 4th century evangelization built upon the earlier foundation established through the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8. Ethiopian Christianity didn't begin in the 4th century. It was formalized and made official then. Dr. Philip Jenkins, a historian of global Christianity at Baylor University, has written extensively about how African Christianity is far older and more significant than Eurocentric histories acknowledge. In his research, he documents that by the 5th and 6th centuries CE, there were thriving Christian communities throughout North Africa, Nubia, and Ethiopia. These African churches produced significant theologians, Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine of Hippo, and developed their own theological traditions. They weren't passive recipients of European Christianity, they were active participants in shaping Christian doctrine. Ethiopian Christianity, in particular, maintained independence from both Byzantine and Roman ecclesiastical control. When the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE created a major schism between Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian Christianity over the nature of Christ, the Ethiopian Church sided with the Egyptian Coptic position, further distancing itself from Byzantine Christianity. This ecclesiastical independence meant that Ethiopian Christianity developed its own structures, liturgy, and biblical canon without being subject to the decisions made by councils dominated by Mediterranean bishops. The Ethiopian Church also became a refuge for traditions and texts that were being suppressed elsewhere. When Gnostic Christians fled persecution in Egypt and the Mediterranean world, some may have brought their texts to Ethiopia. When Jewish Christian communities were marginalized by increasingly Gentile Christianity, Ethiopian Christianity maintained stronger connections to Jewish practices. The result is a form of Christianity that feels fundamentally different from Western Christianity, not because it's a corruption or later development, but because it represents one of the original, ancient forms of the faith. We've covered a lot of ground, 15 additional books in the Ethiopian Bible, detailed accounts of angelic beings and spiritual warfare, alternative timelines of Jesus' life, the possibility that the Ark of the Covenant has been in Africa for millennia, an ancient African Christianity that developed independently from European control. But why does any of this matter to you today in the 21st century? Because the recovery of these lost texts and traditions isn't just about ancient history. It's about understanding who controls knowledge, who decides what truth is, and how power shapes what we're allowed to believe. For nearly 2,000 years, Western Christianity has operated with a reduced biblical canon. Entire books were excluded. Complex theological frameworks about creation, angels, and the nature of evil were lost. Alternative perspectives on Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and early Christian community were suppressed. This wasn't an accident. This was the result of specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments in history, people with power, with agendas, with theological positions they wanted to enforce. The Ethiopian Bible stands as physical evidence that things could have been different. Christianity didn't have to develop the way Western Christianity did. The books that councils excluded weren't inherently heretical or false. They were simply inconvenient to the theological and political structures that were being built. Dr. Elaine Pagels, in her groundbreaking research on the Gnostic Gospels and early Christian diversity, has documented how the process of creating orthodoxy required the simultaneous creation of heresy. Texts and traditions that emphasized personal spiritual knowledge, female leadership, or mystical experience were labeled deviant to consolidate institutional power. The Ethiopian Church, by virtue of geography and independence, preserved some of what was lost elsewhere. But here's the deeper question. If these texts were excluded from Western Christianity, what else was excluded? What other truths, perspectives, or teachings were deemed too dangerous for ordinary believers to access? The rediscovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 20th century revolutionized biblical scholarship by showing that ancient Judaism was far more diverse than previously understood. The Nag Hammadi Library did the same for early Christianity. Now in the 21st century, we're seeing increased scholarly attention to traditions that were long dismissed: Ethiopian Christianity, Eastern Orthodox traditions, Syriac Christianity, Coptic traditions. Each preserves elements that were lost in Western Christianity's development. This creates both opportunity and responsibility. The opportunity is to recover a more complete picture of what early Christianity actually was, not the sanitized uniform tradition that later councils wanted to project backwards onto history, but the diverse, complex, sometimes contradictory movement that was actually spreading through the ancient world. The responsibility is to approach these discoveries with humility and intellectual honesty. We can't simply cherry-pick texts that support our preferred theology while ignoring those that challenge it. We can't claim to want hidden truth while maintaining comfortable assumptions. According to research by Dr. Bart Ehrman and other textual scholars, every generation of Christians has had to wrestle with questions about biblical authority, textual reliability, and the relationship between tradition and truth. Our generation faces these questions with more information than any previous generation and with less excuse for ignorance. The Ethiopian Bible doesn't destroy Western Christianity, as the provocative title of this investigation suggests, but it does challenge the assumption that Western Christianity represents the only valid form of the faith or the only authentic interpretation of biblical texts. It reminds us that Christianity is, and always has been, a global, diverse, culturally varied religion. What developed in Europe isn't normative for Christians in Africa, Asia, or the Middle East. The biblical canon that Protestants accept isn't binding on Orthodox, Catholic, or Coptic Christians. This realization can be unsettling. If the Bible you grew up with isn't the only version, if the doctrines you were taught aren't universally accepted, if the history you learned was incomplete or biased, then what can you trust? Perhaps the answer is to trust the evidence, trust the manuscripts, trust the archaeological record, trust the historical research being done by scholars who are attempting to reconstruct what actually happened, regardless of how it challenges traditional narratives. The Ethiopian Bible offers us a gift, the opportunity to see Christianity through different eyes, to recognize that truth is often more complex than we've been told, to acknowledge that people in power throughout history have made decisions that shaped what we believe, and that we have the right and responsibility to question those decisions. You don't have to become Ethiopian Orthodox to appreciate what their tradition preserves. You don't have to accept every claim or believe every legend, but you do owe it to yourself to ask, if this much was hidden, what else haven't they told me? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future revelations. Don't miss the next video where we'll continue uncovering truths that have remained hidden for centuries. And if you truly feel called to go deeper, consider joining as a member. Our community is already accessing research and discussions we can never make fully public. Thanks for watching until the end. I'll see you in the next investigation.